Can Donald Trump end the Gulf crisis? The U.S. president is soon to meet leaders who imposed the blockade on Qatar 8 months ago. But what does he have to offer the Saudis and their allies? And would he force a settlement on U.S. allies in this volatile region? This is Inside Story. Hello and welcome to Inside Story from Doha. I'm Mohammed Jamjoom. The diplomatic crisis between Gulf countries is now in its 9th month. Saudi Arabia, the UAE, Bahrain and Egypt cut diplomatic relations with Qatar and imposed a land, sea and air blockade last June. Qatar strongly denies their accusations of funding terrorism. Despite repeated efforts by Kuwait to mediate, the stalemate continues. But could meetings starting next month between the U.S. president and leaders of the Gulf Cooperation Council help end the crisis? Those talks, which are also due to continue in April, will reportedly center around the possibility of establishing a GCC summit later this year and discuss the regional role of Iran. The U.S. and the EU have repeatedly called on the blockading countries to negotiate. Its first intervention happened just after the blockade. When Donald Trump appeared to back the blockade in a series of tweets about Qatar, this was countered by U.S. Defense Secretary James Mattis and Secretary of State Rex Tillerson, who both called for calm. By July, Rex Tillerson visited the region in support of Kuwait's mediation efforts to bring all sides together. During that trip, he signed a memorandum of understanding with Qatar on countering terrorism. And in November, the first bilateral counter-terrorism dialogue was held in Washington between the U.S. and Qatar. Then last month, Qatar and the U.S. held their strategic dialogue. Washington pledged to work jointly with Qatar to deter any external threat to Qatar's territorial integrity. And Qatar announced it will expand the Al-Udeid air base, which is host to some 11,000 U.S. military personnel. Let's now get the thoughts of our guests. Joining me here in studio, Majed Al-Ansari, professor at Qatar University, Shafiq Ghabra, professor of political science at Kuwait University, and also in Doha, Mark Farha, assistant professor at the Doha Institute for Graduate Studies. Welcome to you all. Majed, I want to start with you. If these meetings actually happen with President Trump, do you believe that that could lead to a summit happening in which the leaders of all the GCC countries would sit together and talk?
Well, Mohammed, this is certainly the million-dollar question. It seems like that the White House would like to appear as if it is reaching an end to this crisis. President Trump would like to be the person who would end this crisis, apparently, after being blamed for starting it, or at least instigating the incident that started it. While at the same time, what we're seeing now is that the blockading countries have not changed their positions. Qatar has not changed its position, so there is no real change on the ground when it comes to what the dialogue can be about. Now, the fact that Trump will be receiving the GCC leaders in that order, starting with Saudi Arabia, then the UAE, then Qatar, kind of tells you that the main concessions have to be made by Saudi Arabia and the UAE, and this is why they're coming first. They're coming first in order to make sure that they agree to holding a dialogue, which is something they haven't agreed to until now. While the Emir of Qatar, His Highness, will be coming at the end of this to kind of sum up what will happen at the dialogue. The State Department, apparently, they're trying to dilute the issue, saying that even if there was a summit held in Camp David, the crisis will not be the only issue on the table. So even if they couldn't succeed in brokering a deal at that time, they'd at least say that we had a discussion about Daesh, about Iran, about the other issues in the region, and kind of let that crisis issue unfold as it goes. However, I'm still very skeptical that such a summit can happen within the current climate.
Okay, Shafiq, what kind of pressure do you believe the U.S. could apply on leaders of Gulf countries to make this happen?
It's very possible that the pressure is a combination of push and pull on so many things. There are so many economic interests. There's so many deals in the pipeline. There is a lot of elements of protection, the military umbrella. I think America and the U.S. does have a leverage, and it doesn't have to be too blunt about that leverage, but it looks that the Gulf crisis since May of 2017 has been very counterproductive to the Americans. Maybe they have gained certain benefits, but they have also lost influence as a result. The Turks are now in the Gulf. Small states are fearful for their independence. New ideology is evolving. Iran did benefit tremendously from the Gulf crisis. It feels at ease, and even when it comes to commerce. And as a result of that, the US feels that this particular crisis has not been helpful. Now, the US is of more than one mind. You have the Trump administration, which is more on the right, in association with the Netanyahu leadership in Israel, which is on the right. That's of one mind. And then you have the State Department and the Pentagon. And it looks to me that the State Department and the Pentagon has been putting a lot of common sense regarding how reckless was this crisis since it started in May, and that as it continues, one way or another, that recklessness continues even with effects into the domestic situation in GCC states.
Okay, Mark, I want to pick up on what Shafiq just said, and I want to go back to the beginning of the crisis, because many believe that this crisis was prolonged because of what Shafiq was talking about, mainly that divide between what President Trump was saying about Qatar and then with what you would hear coming from U.S. Secretary of State Rex Tillerson supporting Qatar. Now, do you believe that this could have ended long ago if there hadn't been these mixed messages coming from D.C.?
Well, yes, I think there's good indication that a lot of this crisis emanated from the divides in Washington itself. And these divides then translated into divides in the region, within the Gulf states themselves. But as Shafiq was saying, and others as well, I mean, the problem now we have is not just do you have this showdown, which is very dangerous, between Iran and Saudi Arabia, between these two axes, but also within the GCC itself, there's division. And I think it's upon the U.S. now to mend fences, to find a consensus amongst these Gulf states, and then later even a grander consensus, because I think the danger we're having now in Syria and elsewhere is a ratcheting up of the crisis by the United States, whether it be in Israel by taking a very, very pro-Israeli line against all international law, or against Iran as well, courting disaster, or against Russia for that matter. But some of these crises, I just dare say that again before we sort of just blame the Trump administration for everything, were inherited. I mean, a lot of this came from the Obama administration, whether it be the tension with Russia, whether it be Syria or else. So I think we should bear that in mind before we just simplistically say, you know, Trump is at fault for everything. I think the crisis was in the making before, and the tensions were in the making before, and now it is upon us to find solutions to these tensions.
Majed, you were part of the delegation that was in Washington, D.C. last month. Qatar got something that was very important to them, signing those bilateral agreements with Washington. One of them was a promise of protection. The U.S. intends to work jointly with Qatar, it said, to deter and confront external pressures to Qatar's territorial integrity. Just how vitally important was that to Qatar at this time?
The strategic dialogue that took place in Washington wasn't only on its own a product of the bilateral relationship between the United States and Qatar, but it was also a changing and a shifting tone in D.C. You could have heard the confidence in Tillerson's tone during the dialogue and Mattis's, while there was, of course, a lot of hesitation before to support Qatar openly like this, because the institutions of the Pentagon and the state, they knew that anything they could say can be the next day debunked by the president himself, either by a tweet or by something coming out from the White House, a communique or otherwise. So the main difference that we saw when we were in D.C. there is that change of tone into a very confident, pro-Qatari stance position by the United States. We've seen the three officials, Mattis, Tillerson, and the Treasury Secretary, all of them were speaking very fondly of the relationship with Qatar. They were speaking very confidently about the strategic relationship with Qatar. And I think this was mainly due to the fact that the White House has changed its position, not dramatically, but it has at least given way to the State Department and to the Pentagon to run this crisis. They have agreed to what Tillerson's line was from the beginning, which is we have to get our people together. They are our allies, and we have to mobilize our allies through making them speak with one another. And now, of course, we're seeing that the White House is still maintaining that line, supporting what Tillerson is doing. There's very little damage Trump is doing now as compared to the beginning of this crisis. So I think the main thing, the main lesson, the main idea to be taken from the strategic dialogue at the time is that shift in the tone towards Qatar, from accusing Qatar of supporting terrorism to speaking of Qatar as a reliable partner.
Mark, building on what Majed just said, do you believe that President Trump's position now on Qatar is just solidified and in line with Mattis and Secretary Tillerson?
Well, I think it's a little bit too early to tell. I think we'll still have to see what he intends, what his strategy is from this bilateral dialogue. It's not what it was initially designed to be, which is a communal dialogue of all the parties. He's going one by one now, and I think it's a little bit, we'd be jumping the gun if we rush to conclusions here on what exactly is in Trump's head. Maybe he doesn't even exactly know. He's playing it by ear maybe to some degree, but I'm not so sure that it will necessarily follow a distinct strategy. I think he's to some degree playing it impromptu and weighing the options, if you will. To some degree for the U.S., it's not necessarily a disadvantage if there's some squabbling here and there. We know the weapons deals that were being done. But I think in the general picture, and again, I would emphasize this, I think the overall danger here is we're seeing an increase of tension across the region. And it really, really is important now for the United States to go back, because Trump came into the office with a different agenda from Hillary, with ending wars in the Middle East. And instead, what we're seeing is the opposite. He's actually, going down the neocon line once again. And I think that's against his voters and against the American national interest as well.
Shafiq, at this stage, what would Saudi Arabia and the UAE want to get out of, in return from Qatar to try and end this? And then what would Qatar be amenable to doing as far as concessions?
That's a very hard question. It's, as you can see, policies tend to be mostly hard to predict and sudden shifts. We've seen that internally in Saudi Arabia. We've seen that in its overall foreign policy. And however, there will be or must be some sort of a face-saving formula. This to be looked into, given that there has been an agreement on moving forward. It will simply be that. I think there was a motivation in this crisis that was economic, and that failed, if it was really economic. So much of the objectives of the crisis, as we understand it and as we've observed it since May, regarding Qatar has failed from the Saudi Emirati perspective. So what would that face-saving formula be is to be seen, and yet there will be certain benefits. It's hard to see where will Qatar go in these benefits. But I also see established realities that will be very hard to unlock, whether it's Qatar and Oman, or Qatar and Turkey, or the whole issue of trust and mistrust will continue for years to come. It's very hard to delve into such a crisis and expect to just forget it. And so mistrust will continue, and we're going to see expressions of this mistrust. So it can be, when you look at the crisis now, you see that it has reached a climax. What else are you going to do beyond that? And that what is there, I mean, some trade has to come back, the flying, the aeroplanes, the space, etc. But it's not a whole lot that will come back. Qatar did take strategic options anyway. Yet the relationship that the Americans need may force that new equilibrium, and the benefits for Saudi Arabia and the UAE with the Americans also may be of a certain direction that will help the agreement with Qatar. So on a positive note, there is a possibility. On another note, we really don't know. It's still early, and things could happen, and the American administration could also face challenges that are also domestic, and that also in Saudi Arabia, the Yemen war, other aspects. So it's a volatile environment, and we need to keep this as we analyze.
Majed, I was in Kuwait in December covering the last GCC summit. Now, many were surprised that even happened at all, but it was supposed to originally last 2 days. It only lasted a few hours. And at the end of the day, the leaders of the UAE and Saudi Arabia did not even attend. Did that say to you that the GCC is broken beyond repair? I mean, we're talking today about the possibility of another GCC summit, perhaps under the auspices of Washington, D.C. But are we at a point now where the GCC is really broken?
I don't think it's totally broken to the point of no return. I think it suffered a very huge blow. But we have to remember that the GCC as an entity never had such a strong political presence. The GCC always had a very decorative presence to it. You've seen always that political positions towards international and regional issues have always varied between various GCC countries, and they've been part of different parties in different disagreements in the region. We've seen, for example, that even before the Arab Spring, there have been many issues like the war on Gaza, for example, that the Israelis waged in 2008, or other issues. There have always been difference of opinion, and very strong difference of opinion. Some countries in the region belong to, if I might say, even different camps when it comes to the outlook of the region, how it should look. The GCC has always been more of a social and economic body that kind of embodied the shared culture and shared norms of the region, rather than being a political entity that makes sure everybody falls in line. And I think that the Saudis, what they wanted, and the Emiratis from the GCC, is for it to be a vehicle where they actually use it to explore how they can use their political hegemony over the region. And this did not work, and this is why I think they did not attend in very high delegations in December. And I remember when we were there in the hall itself, we've seen how the difference in how the Emir of Kuwait, His Highness Sheikh Sabah, received His Highness the Emir and the other delegations. This summit, to me, was a very strong point where it led Kuwait to say, listen, now your problem is not only with Qatar, it's also with the GCC as a whole. And this actually corrects a wrong that's always been there, saying that this is a GCC crisis where Qatar is pinned against the GCC countries. There are only 3 countries in the GCC that are participating in the blockade against Qatar, while Kuwait and Oman are more neutral. And in the last couple of months, they've been even closer to the Qatari position, supporting dialogue between the different parties. So I believe that GCC right now is certainly in one of its low points in its history, but it can recover whenever, of course, because these regimes are not going to be, I mean, the people who are running these regimes, they're not going to be there forever. So the entity was able to survive because of the Kuwaiti summit and what Kuwait did to make sure that it survives. And I think that it can survive, but it will be certainly weakened by what happened.
Shafiq, where do Kuwait's mediating efforts in this dispute stand right now? Has there been any type of breakthrough in the last few months in trying to resolve all this?
Not a breakthrough. I think Kuwait's success has been through the impact and the approach taken by the Emir of Kuwait, Sheikh Sabah Al-Ahmed, has been clearly to put a kind of a cap, to put a ceiling on the crisis, and to make sure that the crisis does not exceed just being a political, socio-economic media crisis, the way it expressed itself. Kuwait was hoping to avoid a military confrontation, and the effort succeeded. And the Emir of Kuwait said there was such a potential, and he said that in the White House, and that the efforts helped put a cap on that, helped prevent that. And yet, Kuwait's efforts continued through the GCC summit, as failed as it is. It tried to keep the skeleton, and the skeleton continues. And therefore, you will find Kuwait's effort is to keep that balance. Yet, Kuwait, as a small state today, doesn't feel as secure as it was before the crisis, because that crisis showed how fragile was the GCC, how fragile are relations between the GCC countries, that to the point where the Emir of Kuwait said in the White House, when I was in Riyadh, just before the crisis, days before the crisis, during that big summit that brought President Trump, we didn't feel, he said he didn't feel, nobody felt that there was a sense of crisis among at least the Kuwaiti delegation. And yet it came a few days or a couple of weeks later. So that says how fragile. Going beyond that to the future is going to mean a mechanism for conflict resolution. It's going to mean getting more other dimensions, other institutions to participate in the GCC. I mean, more people to people, more assemblies, institutions of law and a court maybe. It needs to develop. If it doesn't develop, it will be, as you said earlier, a different kind of a GCC, an American-led GCC in an area which is not anymore fully influenced by the US, in an area where there are so many paradigms, so many regional players, so many international players, and therefore it will be a totally different form that is not exactly functional.
Mark, has the US's credibility been damaged in this crisis, and if so, how much, in both the region and in particular in GCC countries?
Yes, I mean, I think you see there's been a lack of trust in essence, and on all sides in a way, and therefore also those, since the U.S. still remains a superpower, an effort to sort of win that trust back or win the favors back, but also to hedge and to look to other sources of support, whether it be Iran, Russia, even Turkey, of course. And this is probably the big conflict looming in the background, this showdown now in the Sunni states even. Before we had a Sunni-Shia clash, now we have a Turkey-Saudi Arabia clash, if you want. And the fronts in the GCC, the front lines are clearly drawn. Again, I think U.S. diplomacy as an American citizen should be much more creative, should be much more proactive, and should go new ways. And I would, again, not just blame the Trump administration, but also the previous administration for a lack of creativity, for a foreign policy which was based basically on guns and bombs and not on creative diplomacy and regime change in a way. So I think a new paradigm is needed desperately, and even though Trump was supposed to bring that new paradigm, what we're seeing is much of the old and then some, in fact. And I think that's a big danger now in the future still.
Majed, even if the GCC does meet under the auspices of Washington, what could come out of this? Do you think that a success would just be that there is a meeting, or that there have to be concrete agreements made at such a meeting?
Well, to borrow the term used by Professor Al-Ghabra, there are a lot of faces to be saved. And in order to broker any kind of deal between these countries, these faces have to be considered. And here I'm talking about Saudi Arabia, who needs not get out of this crisis as a loser. It's very important for the vision of the new administration or the new heir apparent and the king in Saudi Arabia to appear victorious out of this crisis. And this, of course, will not work for the Qataris, who need to establish their sovereignty, who need to establish their strength and their positioning in this region, and cannot abide by any perception that they've come out of this issue as losers, or that they kind of gave in to the demands of the countries. The United States also wants to come out, and Trump's administration especially wants to come out as problem solvers and as peace bringers, and they want to be able to say that we control our allies, we can push our allies to the direction that we see fit, and we can solve problems when we need to. And these collection of faith-saving exercises will be quite difficult to come by and come out with a solution unless the United States decides, listen, we'd like to pressure one side more than the other. And they know that this is very dangerous. If they push the Qataris can go towards Russia, can be less abiding to the US, and can feel themselves to be even less inclined to, with the project of the base, Al Udeid base, and enlarging it to 2040, from here to 2040. If they pressure the Saudis and the Emiratis, there is nobody has an idea what they can do actually in the region. They could simply just, because it's very volatile and what they've been doing is very disruptive, it could all just blow up in 1 second. So it is a very difficult mix that needs to be done in Washington. I think at the end, only one thing can be done. It's just getting people to sit down together and talk about the issue, this in itself will be a step towards a solution.
All right, we're going to have to leave it there. Thanks to all our guests, Majed Al-Ansari, Shafiq Ghabra, and Mark Farha. And thank you, too, for watching. You can see the program again anytime by visiting our website, aljazeera.com. And for further discussion, go to our Facebook page. That's facebook.com/AJ Inside Story. You can also join the conversation on Twitter. Our handle is @AJ Inside Story. For me, Mohammed Jamjoom, and the whole team here, bye for now.